They didn't just mock her. They grabbed the fabric of her only dress, the one she'd sewn by hand, stitch by painful stitch, and tore it apart in front of everyone, right there on Main Street, in broad daylight. While the whole town watched and said nothing, not one person moved. Not one voice rose in her defense. Hazel Rowan stood in the dirt, trembling, holding the shredded pieces of the only thing she had left, while Margaret Hollis and her circle of fine ladies laughed, like it was the funniest thing they'd seen all season. But they hadn't seen what was coming down the mountain road yet. If this kind of story speaks to something deep in you, the kind where dignity gets torn apart before it gets rebuilt, then subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because what happens next? Nobody in Iron Ridge saw it coming, and neither will you. The stage wagon hit a rut so hard that Hazel Rowan's carpet bag slid off the seat and landed on her feet. She didn't make a sound. She'd learned a long time ago that making sounds when things hurt only invited attention, and attention, in her experience, was never the good kind. She picked the bag up, settled it back on her lap, and looked out through the cracked canvas flap at the settlement coming into view. Iron Ridge. It wasn't much to look at. A row of buildings that couldn't quite decide if they wanted to be permanent. A water trough that needed replacing. A church with a listing steeple. A general store with a hand-painted sign so faded you had to squint to read it. But to Hazel, it was everything. Because somewhere in that cluster of weathered wood and wagon ruts lived her cousin Edmund and his wife Clara, and they had written, well, Edmund had written, that there might be work available. Come if you have no other option, he'd said, which wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it was the closest thing she had to one. She had no other option. She had come. The wagon driver, a heavy-set man named Pete, who'd barely spoken to her the entire 2-day ride except to ask if she needed to stop, pulled the horses to a halt at the end of Main Street. "This is as far as I go," he said, not unkindly. "This is far enough," Hazel said. She climbed down from the wagon with the particular care of someone who had learned that the world was generally not built for her body. The step was high. She took it slow. Behind her, she heard a small snicker from somewhere on the boardwalk, and she kept her face forward and her chin level and pretended she hadn't. The carpet bag was heavier than it looked. It wasn't that there was so much in it: a spare chemise, a tin comb, her mother's scissors, a small Bible she never opened anymore but couldn't bring herself to leave behind, and about $3.40 sewn into the lining. What made it heavy was what it represented. Everything. All of it. Every last thing she owned in this world. She asked a man sweeping his porch where she might find the Hargrove place. Edmund's surname was Hargrove, Clara's by marriage, and the man pointed without looking at her directly. "East end of town," he said. "Blue door." She found it without trouble. The door wasn't blue anymore. It had been once, but the paint had weathered down to a pale suggestion of color. She knocked twice. Clara opened the door. Hazel had met Clara only once before, at a cousin's wedding when they were both much younger. In her memory, Clara had been pleasant enough, a little stiff, a little watchful, the kind of woman who always knew where she stood in a room and worked to maintain it. The woman in the doorway now had that same quality, only amplified. She was thinner than Hazel remembered. She wore a very clean dress, and the look on her face when she saw Hazel was not one you could mistake for gladness. "Hazel," she said. It wasn't a greeting so much as a confirmation, the way you'd say the name of something you'd been hoping wouldn't arrive. "Clara, hello." But Hazel tried to keep her voice warm. "Edmund wrote that I might—" "Edmund is at the store." Clara glanced past Hazel, down the street, as if checking to see who might be watching. "You'd better come inside." The house was tidy, the kind of tidy that takes real effort to maintain and which functions partly as communication. This house is respectable, and so are the people in it. There were 2 chairs near the fire, a table with a pressed cloth, curtains that matched. Hazel set her carpet bag down near the door because she didn't want to presume. "You're larger than I remembered," Clara said. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you might note that the weather had turned. "I suppose I am," Hazel said. "Edmund didn't mention—" "What did Edmund mention exactly?" Clara's mouth pressed into a thin line. "He said you needed temporary placement." Work, possibly. That's right. Well, Clara sat down in one of the chairs, though she didn't offer Hazel the other one. The trouble is, Edmund's business depends very much on the goodwill of the people in this town. And the people in this town are, she searched for the word, particular. Particular, Hazel repeated, about appearances, about who is associated with whom. Clara folded her hands. You understand? I understand that you're telling me you won't help me. It wasn't said as an accusation, just a fact. Hazel was very good at hearing facts even when they were wrapped in careful language. Clara's chin lifted slightly. I'm telling you that Edmund's position is delicate, and that having you staying here, being seen here, being connected to us publicly, might create difficulties we cannot afford. I see. There's a boarding house on the north end of town, Mrs. Abernathy's. She might have a room. Might. You'd have to speak to her yourself. Hazel picked up her carpet bag. Her hands were very steady. She was proud of that. Thank you for your time, Clara. But Hazel was already at the door. Quote, Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house did have a room. The problem was the rate. $2 a week, Mrs. Abernathy said, eyeing Hazel with the frank appraisal of a woman who had spent 40 years reading people at her front door. She was short, bird-boned, with silver hair pinned up tight. Not unkind exactly, but practical to the bone. I have $3.40, Hazel said. Total. Then you have about a week and a half, and then you have a problem. I'll find work before then. Mrs. Abernathy looked at her for a moment that stretched just long enough to mean something. The dress shop won't take you. Margaret Hollis runs it, and she's... Well, you'll find out. The laundry might. They're always short, but it's hard work. I'm not afraid of hard work. No, Mrs. Abernathy said, something shifting slightly in her expression. I don't suppose you are. She stepped back from the door. Come on then, room's on the second floor, small window, but it faces east so you get the morning light. Hazel followed her inside. The laundry work paid 40 cents a day, which wasn't enough, and she knew it. She took the work anyway and spent her evenings calculating numbers in her head while lying on the narrow bed in Mrs. Abernathy's second-floor room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the town settle into night. She'd been in Iron Ridge 4 days when she had her first real encounter with the women. There were 3 of them, and they moved through town like weather, the kind of weather that knows it controls the atmosphere. Margaret Hollis was the center of it. She owned the dress shop, which meant she controlled what the respectable women of Iron Ridge wore, and controlling what women wore in a frontier town was not a small thing. It meant she controlled aspiration. She was tall, handsome in a sharp-boned way, with eyes that assessed everything and found it either useful or not. The other 2, Hazel learned their names later, Dottie Crane and Vera Mast, moved in Margaret's orbit with the practiced ease of women who had decided long ago that adjacency to power was the next best thing to having it themselves. Hazel was coming out of the laundry with her hands red and her back aching when they passed. Margaret stopped. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked. The way you might look at something that had wandered into the wrong part of town. Not threatening, exactly, just misplaced. You're Edmund Hargrove's relation, she said. Not a question. Distant, Hazel said. By marriage. He didn't mention you'd be coming. There was something in her tone that implied Edmund had been wise not to. I expect he forgot. Margaret's eyes moved over Hazel slowly. There was nothing subtle about it. It was meant to be seen, meant to communicate something to Dottie and Vera and to Hazel herself, all at once. Hazel stood still and let it happen, because there was nothing else to do. That dress, Dottie said, from slightly behind Margaret's shoulder. She said it the way you'd say that smell. Hazel had made the dress herself. It was the only one she'd brought. She'd had 2, but the second had given out at the seams the winter before, and she hadn't had the money to replace the fabric. This one was brown wool, a little worn at the elbows, let out at the sides as much as the seams would allow. It was clean. She kept it clean. That was the one thing she had absolute control over. It's a working dress, Hazel said. Her voice was even. It certainly is something, Vera said, and the 3 of them exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation Hazel was not invited to. I hope you find your footing here, Margaret said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. Then she moved on, and Dottie and Vera fell into step behind her, and Hazel stood on the boardwalk with her hands at her sides and breathed through it. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since her mother died, and she didn't intend to start now, and certainly not here. She walked back toward the boarding house, and halfway there, she passed the general store. There was a notice board outside. She stopped. One notice had been there long enough to have a curled edge. She read it twice. Then she went inside Shem. The general store was run by a man named Chester Doyle, who was round and red-faced and gave the impression of a man perpetually slightly surprised by his own existence. He was stacking tins when Hazel came in, and he turned with the automatic smile of a shopkeeper and then recalibrated slightly when he saw who had entered. "Help you?" he said. Hazel gestured toward the door. "The notice. About supply delivery to Silas Boone." Chester's expression changed in a way she couldn't entirely read. Something in it went cautious. "What about it?" "It says the pay is $8 for the round trip." "It does. And it's been up there for—" She looked at the curl of the paper, the fading of the ink. 3 weeks? 4? About that. And no one's taken it. Chester set down the tin he was holding very carefully. "Miss Rowan. Hazel Rowan. Miss Rowan, Silas Boone is—" He stopped, started again. "He's up in the high country. The trail's not easy, especially this time of year, and Boone is—" "What is he?" Chester looked at her. "You're not from here." "I'm from Caldwell County. I've been here 5 days." "Then you haven't heard the stories." "Tell me one." Chester exhaled slowly. "Silas Boone is what you might call a legend, and not entirely the comfortable kind. He came out of the war changed, the way some men come out changed, which is to say in ways that are permanent and not always predictable. Settled up in the mountain and hasn't come down except twice in 4 years. He's big. There are stories about his temper, about what happened to a man who tried to take his traps. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but that man doesn't come to Iron Ridge anymore." "Is he violent without cause?" Chester considered. "Not that anyone can prove. Is the trail passable?" "For a man with a mule and good legs, yes. For—" He stopped himself, and the hesitation was so transparent Hazel almost felt sorry for him. "For someone like me," she said flatly. "I wasn't going to say that. But you were thinking it." Chester had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The supply load is heavy, over 100 pounds. It's steep trail, and Boone himself is—" $8, Hazel said. "That's more than 2 weeks of laundry work. And the laundry is running out of hours to give me anyway." She looked at the notice again, then at Chester. "I'll take it. What do I need to carry?" Chester stared at her for a long moment. Then something in him seemed to reach a decision, the way a man decides to let a river go where it wants to go because he has recognized that he cannot stop it. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. The gun ammunition is heavy, mind you. Some medicines Dr. Stovall sends up, and 2 wool blankets." He scratched the back of his neck. "And there's a letter from the post. Been sitting here 6 weeks because no one will take it up." "Fine. You'll need the store's mule. I'll rent her to you for $1. You bring her back sound." "That leaves $7 net." "That's the arrangement," Hazel nodded. "When can I collect the supplies?" "Morning after next. I'll have them packed." She was almost to the door when Chester called after her. "Miss Rowan?" His voice was different now. Less shopkeeper, more human. "Be careful up there. Not just because of Boone." A pause. "The mountain doesn't care who you are or what you need. It just does what it does." Hazel looked back at him. "I know how that feels," she said. She told Mrs. Abernathy that night, sitting at the small table in the boarding house kitchen after the other lodgers had gone up to bed. Mrs. Abernathy poured 2 cups of something dark and set one in front of Hazel without being asked. "Silas Boone," Mrs. Abernathy said. "You know him?" "Everyone knows of him. Nobody knows him." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He was different before the war, or so I hear. Had a family up in the valley, wife, a boy. Something happened. Nobody talks about it in detail. After the war, he went up to the high country, and that was that. Does he take the supplies when they're delivered? When they manage to get delivered, yes. He pays. Never shortchanges, never trouble. Mrs. Abernathy looked at Hazel steadily. The trouble is the getting there. Last man who tried came back with a broken ankle from the trail before he was halfway up. The one before that turned around because of weather. I'm not turning around, Hazel said. No, Mrs. Abernathy said slowly. I don't think you are. She was quiet for a moment. Margaret Hollis will have something to say about this. About me delivering supplies? About you drawing attention. About you doing something that the men of this town couldn't manage to do. She set down her cup. Margaret doesn't like things she can't control, and she doesn't like women who move through the world in ways she hasn't approved. Hazel thought about the way Margaret's eyes had moved over her on the street, that slow, deliberate inventory. She doesn't need to approve of me, Hazel said. No, Mrs. Abernathy agreed, but she'll try to make you feel like she does. There was a quiet between them, the kind that comes when two women who understand something have finished saying it out loud. Get some sleep, Mrs. Abernathy said finally. If you're going up that mountain, you need to be rested. Hazel went upstairs. She lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the mules she'd never met, and the 100 pounds of supplies, and the mountain she'd never climbed, and the man at the top that everyone was afraid of. She thought about Clara's face in the doorway. She thought about Margaret's eyes moving over her like a slow blade. She thought about $3.40, of which she'd already spent $1.40 on the room, and the laundry hours drying up, and no other option presenting itself. She thought, $8 is $8. And then she closed her eyes, and she slept. 2 mornings later, she was at Chester Doyle's store before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridgeline. The mule's name, Chester told her, was Agnes. Agnes was a gray-brown animal of middle age and deep personal skepticism, who looked at Hazel when she approached and communicated through the pure economy of a mule's expression that she had seen everything and been impressed by nothing. Hello, Agnes, Hazel said. Agnes turned her head slightly away, which Hazel took as a neutral response, and therefore a good start. Chester had the supplies packed into 2 canvas panniers, balanced across Agnes's back. He'd weighed them on his scale, and they came to just over 110 pounds, which made Hazel's stomach tighten slightly, but she kept her face still. Trail starts at the north edge of town, Chester said, checking the straps on the panniers with the efficiency of a man who has done this many times. Follows the creek for about 2 miles, then cuts up steep. You'll see a marked pine. Boone put a blaze on it 4 years ago, where you leave the creek and go straight up. From there, it's about 3 hours. 3 hours if the weather holds, said a voice behind them. Hazel turned. A man she didn't recognize was leaning against the store's outer wall, young, lanky, with the particular ease of someone who belonged everywhere. He looked at Hazel with open curiosity and something that was not quite amusement. This is Tom Riddle, see, no relation to anyone famous, Chester said. He runs errands for me sometimes. Tom, this is Miss Rowan. I know who she is, Tom said. Clara Hargrove's been talking. He pushed off the wall and came over, still looking at Hazel with that direct, uncomplicated appraisal. You really going up? I really am. Huh. He seemed to file this away. The blaze is on the left side of the pine. You go right at it instead of left. You end up on a trail that looks right, but isn't, and you won't figure that out until you've lost an hour. I did that once. You went up there? Chester said, surprised. Halfway. Then I came back down. He said this without apparent shame. The load felt different halfway, heavier than it made sense. He looked at Hazel. Just telling you so you don't make the same mistake at the pine. Left side of the blaze, Hazel said. Thank you. Tom nodded. Then, unexpectedly, he added, Boone won't hurt you. The stories about him are mostly stories. My uncle knew him before, said he was a decent man. He paused. He might not say much, but decent. Hazel held on to that as she took Agnes's lead rope and started north. By the time Main Street fell away behind her and the trail narrowed into the tree line, Iron Ridge had already woken up, and she'd already been seen. She could feel the eyes from the porches, from the windows, the particular quality of attention that comes when something unusual is happening that no one expected. She didn't look back. The morning was cold in the way that early frontier mornings are cold, the kind that sits in your lungs and reminds you that the season is still deciding what it wants to be. The creek ran alongside the trail, clear and fast, chattering over rocks, and Agnes moved with the unhurried authority of an animal that understood its job even if it had opinions about the pace. Hazel talked to Agnes as they walked. She didn't think of it as odd. She'd talked to animals her whole life, on the farm where she'd grown up, then at the various places she'd worked since her mother died, then on the road. Talking to Agnes required no performance, no careful management of expression, no wondering what was being thought about her body, or her dress, or her right to occupy space. "Left side of the blaze," she told Agnes when she thought of it. Agnes's ears moved. "That's right," Hazel said. "We're paying attention." The creek forked at about 2 miles, just as Chester had described, and the trail cut away from the water and began to climb. And then climb harder. Agnes was breathing steadily, her hooves finding purchase with the confidence of a mule that had been on harder trails. Hazel was breathing harder. Her legs knew what to do. She'd spent her whole life in her body, learning what it could do and what it cost. But the grade was steep, and the panniers shifted Agnes's center of gravity in ways that required both of them to adjust constantly. Hazel kept one hand on the lead rope and one on the strap nearest her, ready to help balance if Agnes stumbled. She didn't think about Iron Ridge. She didn't think about Clara's face or Margaret's eyes, or the $3.40 she'd started with, or the 40 cents a day at the laundry. She thought about left side of the blaze, and when she found the marked pine, unmistakable, tall and solitary, with the blaze cut deep and dark into the bark at shoulder height, she went left, and the trail opened up, and she kept climbing. 3 hours, Chester had said. She didn't count the hours. She counted steps. 1 foot, then the other. That was enough. Part 2. The Dangerous Climb. She found the cabin at the end of the 3rd hour, or what she estimated was the 3rd hour, though her sense of time had gone loose and unreliable somewhere on the upper section of the trail where the grade had turned genuinely punishing, and she'd stopped thinking about anything except the next 10 feet of ground. The cabin sat in a clearing that opened without warning. One moment she was in dense timber, angling around a rock shelf with Agnes leaning into the slope beside her. And then the trees simply ended, and there it was. Low and dark, built from the mountain itself it seemed, logs cut and fitted with the kind of precision that came from someone who had too much solitary time and had put it to deliberate use. A stone chimney on the north end pushed out a thin thread of smoke. There was a lean-to shed off the east wall, and under it a large bay horse stood with patient stillness, watching Hazel and Agnes come out of the tree line with the mild interest of an animal that had seen stranger things. Hazel stopped. Agnes stopped. The clearing was quiet in the specific way that high places are quiet. Not empty, but layered, full of wind sounds and pine sounds, and the distant talk of something running over rocks, all of it pressed down under a sky that looked close enough to touch. She was about to call out when the cabin door opened. The man who stepped out was big. That was the first thing, and it wasn't a small first thing. He was large in the way that certain men are large who have built themselves through years of actual physical work, rather than through any particular intention, broad through the shoulders, thick in the forearms, a few inches over 6 feet, in a way that the lean-to's overhang would have presented problems for. He had a dark beard going gray at the jaw, and his hair needed cutting, and he was wearing a work shirt that had been mended in 3 visible places. He held the door with one hand and looked at her, and his face was difficult to read from that distance. Not hostile, not welcoming, guarded, the way a man's face goes guarded when something happens that he hadn't prepared for. His eyes moved to Agnes, to the panniers, to the load, then back to Hazel. "You're from the store," he said. His voice carried across the clearing without effort, low and worn in, like leather that had been worked soft. "Chester Doyle's, yes." Hazel started Agnes moving again, closed the distance between them to a reasonable talking range, and stopped. Up close he was more tired-looking than he was fierce-looking, which she filed away. "I have your supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. There's 2 kinds. Chester packed them separate and marked them. Medicines from Dr. Stovall, 2 wool blankets, and a letter from the post. Been there 6 weeks, apparently." Silas Boone looked at her for another moment. "You come up alone," he said. "Agnes came with me." "But yes." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "How long did it take you?" 3 hours, maybe a little over." He came down the 2 porch steps and walked to Agnes, checking the straps on the panniers with quick, practiced hands. Not inspecting her work, Hazel thought. Inspecting the load itself, making sure nothing had shifted or gotten wet. He worked efficiently and without comment for a moment. "Trail get rough near the second switchback?" he said, not looking up. "The one where the loose shale cuts across?" "That one. Agnes didn't love it." "Nobody loves it." He unclipped the first pannier and lifted it with one arm, which told Hazel something about him. "Come on. I'll get this inside and then I'll get you your payment." Hazel took the second pannier herself and followed him. The inside of the cabin was warmer than outside and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something that might have been pine resin or might have been the walls themselves. It was a single large room with a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall, a long work table, a built-in bunk, shelves from floor to ceiling on the east wall, loaded with things that had been put there with care: tools, books, jars, coils of rope, 3 rifles in a rack mounted high up near the roof. It was cluttered in the way of a place where one person lives and works and doesn't bother managing appearances, but not in the way of a place where someone has given up. Silas set the pannier on the work table and started unpacking it. Hazel set hers beside it and stepped back, giving him room. She looked at the shelves. There were more books than she'd expected, a lot more. Their spines were worn. "You read much," she said. He glanced at her, then at the shelves, as if reminding himself of their existence. "Winters are long." "What do you read?" He didn't answer right away, which she'd already started to understand was a feature of how he spoke. He considered things before he said them, which meant when he said them they tended to be what he actually meant. "History, some natural science. I had a set of encyclopedias." He paused. "They burned." She didn't ask how. He pulled the letter from the second pannier and held it for a moment without opening it, looking at the handwriting on the outside. 6 weeks, he said. That's what Chester said. Something shifted in his expression, the barest tightening around the eyes. He set the letter on the table with deliberate care, not tucking it away, just setting it aside the way you set aside something you need to read when you're ready to read it. "Coffee?" he said. Hazel blinked. "I don't want to put you out. You carried 100+ pounds up 3 hours of mountain trail." He was already moving to the fire, where a blackened pot sat on a hook over the coals. "You can have coffee." She sat down on the single chair near the table because he didn't seem to have more than one, and he used the overturned flat-top storage box near the hearth, which told her even more about the man. He didn't entertain, didn't plan for company, but when company arrived, he adapted without fuss. He handed her a mug. The coffee was very strong and slightly bitter, and exactly what she needed after 3 hours on the mountain. "Doyle sent 3 people up before you," Silas said. He settled onto the box across from her, wrapping both hands around his own mug. "Past 2 months, none of them made it. I heard. You heard and came anyway. The pay is $8. He studied her over the rim of his mug. Not the way Margaret Hollis had studied her. Not that slow inventory that reduced you to a list of deficiencies. This was different. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand, not something you're trying to categorize. "New to Iron Ridge, P?" he said. 5 days. "Where before?" "Caldwell County, mostly. Moved around some." She drank her coffee. "I have a distant cousin there, Edmund Hargrove." "I know Edmund." He said it neutrally, which took some effort, Hazel could tell. "He didn't have room for me," she said. Simpler than the truth, but close enough. Silas nodded once, not pressing it. "And the work in town?" Laundry? 40 cents a day when there were hours. There weren't always hours. So you came up the mountain. So I came up the mountain. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in one of those long, rolling waves of sound that you could almost mistake for something breathing. The fire popped. "How's your back?" he said, and the directness of it startled her slightly. Honest answer or polite answer? You don't seem like someone who wastes time on polite answers. Burning, she said. The load shifted twice on the upper section, and I had to rebalance it, and the second time I had to put my shoulder into Agnes's flank to keep her from sliding, and I think I did something in my lower left side that I'm going to feel for a week. Silas put his mug down. Let me look at the packing on the return load. I can manage. I know you can manage, he said, cutting her off without rudeness, just a flat certainty. I'm going to repack the panniers anyway because I'm sending some things back to Doyle. So let me do it in a way that sits better on the animal. He paused. Unless you have an objection to that. She didn't have an objection. She recognized that he was offering without making it feel like charity, and she was experienced enough at receiving both genuine help and condescending pity to know the difference. No objection, she said. Imam. He paid her the $8 from a tin box on the shelf, counted out without ceremony. Then he spent 20 minutes repacking the panniers with outgoing items. A bundle of cured hides, 3 sealed jars of something she didn't ask about, a folded piece of paper that he addressed and sealed and gave to her for the post, and redistributing the weight with the methodical attention of a man who understood loads and terrain and the relationship between the two. Hazel watched him work and didn't offer to help because he clearly knew what he was doing and she wasn't going to insert herself into a process that was going well without her. The shale section, he said, while he was working, on the way down. Go wide on the left, past the dead spruce. There's a deer trail that cuts around it, longer by about 10 minutes, but the footing's solid. Okay. And if the wind picks up before you're out of the upper timber, stop and wait it out. I've had trees come down in bad gusts on that section. Understood. He straightened up from the panniers and looked at the angle of the light through the small window above the work table. You've got time to make it back before dark if you leave within the half hour. I know, Hazel said. She stood up, set the empty mug on the table. Thank you for the coffee. He picked up the panniers and carried them outside, all of it in 2 trips, and reattached them to Agnes while Hazel checked the lead rope. The bay horse and the lean-to watched this process with continued mild interest. What's his name? Hazel asked, nodding toward the horse. Silas looked up. Something in his face went briefly different. Not soft exactly, but less armored. Franklin. That's a good name for a horse. He had it when I found him. A pause. He was in bad shape, left in a hobble line by someone who didn't come back for him. That was 3 years ago. Hazel looked at Franklin, who was solid and well-fed and stood with the easy confidence of an animal that knew where it was and trusted the place. He looks fine now. He is, Silas said. There was a beat between them, the kind that happens when something has been said that is actually about more than what was said. Then Hazel gathered Agnes's lead rope and started for the tree line. Miss Rowan, Silas called. She turned. He was standing by Agnes's flank, one hand on the pannier strap he'd just adjusted, looking at her with that same direct, reading expression he'd had since she'd walked out of the timber. Next time Doyle needs a delivery, he said, tell him I'll pay 10. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll tell him, she said. Wool Dasin. She made it down in just under 3 hours. The deer trail around the shale section was exactly what he'd said it would be. Longer, but solid, and Agnes moved on it without the nervous sideways tendency she'd shown on the loose rock. Hazel went wide as directed and saved herself whatever it would have cost her to have Agnes stumble on the descent. The wind did pick up once in the upper timber, a hard gust that moved through the canopy and made everything creak in a way that felt genuinely threatening. She stopped where she was, stood against a broad fir with one hand on Agnes's halter, and waited. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then it settled. She kept moving. By the time Iron Ridge came back into view through the trees, the light was going gold and lateral, long shadows stretching east. Hazel's back ached with the specific deep throb of muscles that had been worked beyond their daily expectation, and her legs were communicating with her in an urgent and unpleasant way, and she was hungry, not having eaten since the biscuit and piece of salt pork she'd had at 4 in the morning before she left. She didn't care about any of it. $8. In her pocket, more than she'd had when she arrived. She returned Agnes to Chester's yard behind the store, removed the panniers and stacked them, and checked Agnes over. Legs, hooves, back where the saddle rack sat, with thorough attention before she let herself think about food. Agnes was sound, a little tired, but sound. Chester came out to meet her as she was finishing. "You made it," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite disbelief, but was close enough to it to be notable. "I made it." Was he? Chester seemed to choose his words. Was Boone? He was fine, Hazel said. He was decent. He repacked the outgoing load himself, he paid without argument, and he said to tell you that the next delivery he'll pay 10. Chester was quiet for a moment. 10. 10. Huh. He took the outgoing panniers and looked at them, then at Hazel, with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something closer to respect than he'd managed in their earlier dealings. "There's a folded paper in there for the post." "I know. He addressed it himself." Chester nodded slowly. "You look hungry," he said. "I'm extraordinarily hungry. Go on to Abernathy's. I'll tell her to put something on for you. Consider it—" He stopped. Started again. "Consider it the store's contribution to a successful business arrangement." Hazel almost said, "You don't have to do that." She stopped herself. She was tired and hungry, and she'd earned $8, and she was done declining things she needed. "Thank you," she said instead. She slept 11 hours that night. When she woke, the morning light was full through the east window, and something felt different in the way the day sat around her, though she couldn't have said exactly what it was. What she didn't know yet was that the story of her climb had already moved through Iron Ridge the way stories move through small places, faster than feet, quieter than speaking, touching every corner before you've had time to manage it. Tom Riddle had seen her leave in the morning. Old Harvey Spence, who spent most of his mornings on the bench outside the feed store, had seen her come back. Chester Doyle had said something to someone, and that someone had said something to someone else. And by breakfast time the morning after, the fact of what Hazel Rowan had done had acquired a life of its own in the town's collective awareness. She felt it when she came down for breakfast at Mrs. Abernathy's. The other two boarders, a quiet surveyor named Webb and a young man waiting on a land deed whose name she hadn't learned yet, both looked up when she came in, and neither of them looked away the way people usually looked away from her. The young man said, "Morning," which was more than he'd said to her in 5 days. Webb offered her the bread basket. Small things, but things. Mrs. Abernathy set a plate in front of her with an extra piece of bacon on it that hadn't been discussed, and said, "I heard Boone paid well and didn't give you any trouble." "He didn't give me any trouble," Hazel confirmed. "Chester's already got a second order list started," Mrs. Abernathy said, going back to the stove. "If you're interested." "When?" 2 weeks. Hazel ate her extra bacon and considered what 2 weeks of wages at 40 cents a day looked like against what $8 looked like, and the math was uncomplicated. "Tell Chester I'm interested," she said. She didn't see Silas Boone again for 2 weeks, which made sense since he lived on a mountain, but she thought about the cabin more than she'd have expected. Not about Silas specifically, or not only, but about the quality of the quiet up there. The specific weight of a place where no one was performing anything for anyone else's benefit. Where the horse in the lean-to had a name and a history and had been pulled from a bad situation and given a decent one. Where the books on the shelves were read until they went soft at the spines. She did 2 more laundry shifts, which were slow and damp and paid 40 cents each, and she spent 2 evenings helping Mrs. Abernathy repair the boarding house back fence, which wasn't paid work but which earned her a month's reduced rate on the room, which was better than paid work in its own way. She sent a letter to her mother's older sister in the Eastern Territory, the only other living relative she had any connection to, with no expectation of reply, but with the feeling that she should try. Tom Riddle found her on the 3rd day and asked, with the casual air of someone who had been trying to figure out how to ask for 2 days, what Silas Boone's cabin was like. Like a place where a man has been alone for a long time and doesn't know yet whether that's what he wants or just what he's used to, Hazel said. Tom looked at her for a moment. That's a strange answer. It was a strange question. He seemed to find this satisfying. After that, he started saying hello to her on the street, which led to a few short conversations, which led to Hazel learning that Tom was 24, had been in Iron Ridge since he was 12, and had opinions about Chester Doyle's bookkeeping that were both detailed and well-founded. He was the first person under 60 she'd had a real conversation with since she'd arrived, and the normalcy of it, just two people talking with no particular agenda, did something small but real for her sense of herself. What it didn't do was affect the other part of the town's social landscape. If Tom and Mrs. Abernathy and Chester Doyle and old Harvey Spence represented one current running through Iron Ridge, Margaret Hollis and her circle represented a stronger and colder one that ran in the opposite direction, and the fact that Hazel had made the mountain delivery did not endear her to that current. If anything, it made things worse. She understood this the morning she passed the dress shop and saw Margaret watching from the window. Not browsing, not arranging. Watching. Just standing there behind the glass, watching Hazel walk by, with an expression that Hazel couldn't fully read, but which made the back of her neck prickle. Dottie Crane was in the general store the afternoon Chester paid Hazel for the second delivery, $12 this time, the second and third combined because he'd had additional items, and Dottie saw the bills change hands. Hazel knew she saw it because she heard Dottie go very quiet in a specific way that meant she was storing information. What people did with information in a small town was never neutral. Well, the second delivery to Silas happened on a Tuesday. The weather had shifted since the first trip. Colder now, with a bite in the wind that wasn't going to leave until spring, and the upper timber was loud with it. Agnes seemed less skeptical this time, or at least equally skeptical but resigned to the situation, which amounted to the same thing operationally. The trail was harder in the cold. The shale section had developed a thin rime of ice along its edges that hadn't been there before, which was exactly what it sounded like, and Hazel went even wider around it than Silas had recommended, adding nearly 20 minutes to her route, but keeping both herself and Agnes on stable ground. When she came out of the timber into the clearing, Silas was already outside. He was splitting wood with the focused, repetitive efficiency of a man who does it the same way every time because that's the way that works. He looked up when he heard Agnes on the trail, and he set the axe down and came to help with the panniers before she'd even fully come to a stop. "Ice on the shale," he said. "I went wide." "Good." He took the heavier pannier. "How far wide?" "Past that big blowdown, the double spruce." He nodded. "That's right. In another week, you'll need to go wider still. It gets worse before it gets better." He glanced at Agnes. "She's moving sound." "She is. We had a good pace today." Hazel unclipped the second pannier. "She still doesn't like me." "Agnes doesn't like anybody." "She seems to like you." "She tolerates me," he said. "There's a difference." Inside, he'd made coffee again without being asked, which she appreciated without saying so. The cabin was the same, which was somehow reassuring. The same shelved disorder, the same methodical use of space, the same fire built with the same quality of attention. A different book lay open on the work table, closed now, but with a strip of leather marking the page. "What are you reading?" she said. He glanced at the book. "Natural History of the Western Ranges. There's a section on winter ecology. What the mountain does when the cold sets in, what moves, what stays." He paused. "I like understanding the patterns of a place." "That makes sense," she said. "If you're going to live in it." "Exactly." He poured her coffee. "You're staying in town then, not passing through." It was said as an observation, not a question, but she answered it as a question because it felt like one. "Trying to," she said. "It's..." The welcome was mixed. Iron Ridge has a way of being mixed. "Margaret Hollis," Hazel said. Silas went still for just a fraction of a second. "Yes." "She watches me," Hazel said. "I don't mean, it's not that she bothers me exactly. I've been bothered by people before. It's the quality of it. She watches me the way someone watches a problem they're figuring out how to solve." Silas sat down on the box near the hearth, his elbows on his knees, his mug in both hands. He looked at the fire for a moment. "She ran the last two women out of town who she decided were problems," he said. I heard this from Chester 2 winters ago. One was a widow who'd come to take work at the laundry. The other was a school teacher. He turned the mug. I don't know the details, just that they came and then they were gone, and Margaret had something to do with why. Hazel absorbed this. How? She said. Social pressure, mostly. The kind that comes from every direction at once, so it doesn't look like one person's doing. He looked up at her then, directly. She's not stupid. She doesn't do things that can be pointed at. Hazel drank her coffee and thought about that. I'm not easy to run off, she said. Something moved across Silas's face then. Something she couldn't quite name, but which felt like recognition. The way you look at someone and understand that they mean what they say, not because they're defiant, but because they have already survived worse than what's in front of them, and they know it. No, he said. I didn't think you were. Bitter shot. On the walk back down, with the light going thin and gray through the timber, and Agnes moving steady and sure ahead of her, Hazel found herself thinking about what Silas had said. Not just about Margaret, but all of it. The way he talked, which was like a man who had decided some time ago to say only true things, and had organized his speech accordingly. The way he'd looked at the letter that had been sitting at Chester's for 6 weeks and set it aside with that particular care. She hadn't asked about it. She wasn't going to ask about it. But she thought about it. She thought about a man who had come back from a war changed, who had built something with his hands in the high country and filled it with books and put effort into the fitting of every log, who had found a horse in a bad hobble line and brought it back to health, and who had named it with a name it already had, as if that mattered, as if the horse's history was worth keeping even when everything else had been stripped away. She thought, I know what it is to want the thing you were to count for something even when nobody else can see it anymore. Agnes moved through the last stretch of timber, and the trail leveled out toward the creek, and the sound of the water came up through the cold air, and Hazel followed it back toward town. She was $3 ahead of where she'd been a week ago. She had a room with a morning window. She had coffee with a man on a mountain who told her useful things without making her feel stupid for not already knowing them. It wasn't much, but she'd built things out of less. Part 3. Public humiliation, public defiance. The third delivery came and went without incident, and by the fourth, Chester Doyle had stopped looking surprised when Hazel came back down the mountain with Agnes sound and the outgoing goods accounted for and exact change in the right pocket. He'd started leaving her coffee on the store's back step when she returned, which was not discussed between them and didn't need to be. What did need to be discussed, and wasn't, was the way the temperature in Iron Ridge had shifted in the weeks since Hazel's arrival, not the weather, which had gone genuinely cold now and stayed there, but the social atmosphere, which had developed its own kind of frost. She could feel it in the way certain women stopped talking when she passed, in the way Dottie Crane had started crossing the street to avoid sharing the boardwalk with her, which was such a transparent maneuver that it would have been funny under other circumstances. Margaret Hollis had not crossed the street. Margaret Hollis had done the opposite. She'd begun finding reasons to be in the same spaces as Hazel, the dry goods section of the general store, the post, the narrow stretch of boardwalk outside the laundry. Not speaking to her, just being present, at a distance that was close enough to mean something but far enough to deny intention. Mrs. Abernathy noticed. She's establishing territory, she told Hazel one evening, in the same flat tone she'd used to describe a coming weather front. She does it with anyone she considers a challenge. I'm not challenging her, Hazel said. You exist in a way she didn't authorize, Mrs. Abernathy said. For Margaret, that's the same thing. The specific shape of what Margaret was planning, Hazel didn't know. She knew it was coming the way you know certain storms are coming, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small signals that your body registers before your mind catches up. The way Dottie and Vera had started whispering and stopping. The way Edmund Hargrove, who she occasionally passed on the street, now looked at her with an apology he would never say out loud pressed behind his eyes. The way even Tom Riddle, who was generally cheerful and uncalculating, had said to her one morning quietly, "Watch yourself this week," without being able to explain why he felt the need to say it. She watched herself. It didn't help. It happened on a Wednesday, in the middle of the morning, when the street was at its busiest, and the maximum number of people were available to witness it. Hazel had been to the post, She'd gotten a reply from her mother's sister, a short letter, not warm, but not cold, which she'd folded carefully and put in her pocket to read properly later. And she was coming back down Main Street with the letter in her pocket and her mind partly on the 5th delivery scheduled for next week, and partly on a problem with the back fence at the boarding house that she'd been asked to look at and had some ideas about. She was not paying enough attention to her surroundings. That was the honest truth of it. She had let her guard down, or not down exactly, but redistributed, aimed at practical things, and she was walking with the particular distracted purposefulness of someone who is already inside the next part of their day. Margaret stepped out from the gap between the dress shop and the milliner's next door. Not alone. Dottie was already on Hazel's left, positioned with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. Not this specifically, maybe, but the choreography of encirclement, which requires a kind of rehearsal, even when it's never formal. Vera came from the right, emerging from the milliner's doorway at almost exactly the same moment, which meant they had timed it. They had timed it. Hazel stopped. The street wasn't empty. Harvey Spence was on his bench. 2 men she didn't know were loading a wagon across the way. A woman whose name she thought was Pierce was standing outside the laundry with a bundle. Several people were in various positions between the general store and the post. All of them could see. All of them were, in that particular way people have of watching things without appearing to watch them, already watching. "Miss Rowan," Margaret said. Her voice was pleasant. That was the first signal that this was going to be bad. When Margaret's voice was unpleasant, it meant she was annoyed. When it was pleasant, it meant she had already decided on an outcome. "Mrs. Hollis," Hazel said. Margaret looked at her dress the way she'd looked at it the first time, that same slow inventory, only now she didn't bother with the pretense of casualness. She looked at it directly, with Dottie and Vera flanking her, and she let the silence sit for a moment that was 1 beat too long. "That is the same dress," Margaret said, "that you arrived in." "It is." "You've been here. How long now? 6 weeks?" 7. 7 weeks, Margaret said. She said it thoughtfully, as though 7 weeks were a very long time to have only one dress. "And in 7 weeks you haven't managed to—" "I've managed quite a few things," Hazel said. She kept her voice level. Her pulse was not level, but her voice was. Margaret smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind that has been constructed for public situations. "I heard about your little arrangement with Chester Doyle, the mountain deliveries." She tilted her head slightly. "People talk." "People do. It's an unusual occupation for a woman. It pays $8 a trip." Something flickered behind Margaret's eyes. Not surprised. She'd known the pay rate. Hazel was certain of that. Something else. Recalculation, maybe. A recognition that Hazel wasn't going to be easily embarrassed into silence. "The thing is," Margaret said, and here her voice shifted, went softer and somehow worse for it. "Iron Ridge has a certain standing to maintain. As a community, the way we present ourselves matters. The way—" She paused, her eyes moving over Hazel again. "The people associated with our community present themselves matters." "I keep my dress clean," Hazel said. "It's not about cleanliness." And here it was, Hazel thought. Here was the actual thing, the thing that had been building for 7 weeks, surfacing now in broad daylight on a public street with an audience in place because Margaret had decided the moment was right and had orchestrated accordingly. "It's about suitability," Margaret said. "And frankly, some people are simply—" She nodded at Dottie. Hazel didn't understand what the nod meant until Dottie's hand came out. She grabbed the fabric at Hazel's shoulder. Not pulling yet, just gripping, with the particular grip of a woman who has decided she has the right to touch another person's body and belongings without asking. And Vera's hand came to the other side at almost the same moment, and then they pulled in opposite directions. The seam gave. It didn't tear completely. The dress was wool, dense and tight-woven, and it had been sewn well even if it was worn, but the shoulder seam split with a sound that was much louder than it should have been in the open air, the kind of sound that carries, that makes everyone within 20 feet turn and register that something has just broken. The neckline sagged badly to the left. The sleeve hung wrong. Hazel went very still. She had the sensation of the world going very quiet around her, The way it goes quiet in the moment before something irrevocable happens, and then the world was just the torn shoulder of her only dress, and the feeling of cold air where there hadn't been cold air before, and the faces around her, all of them turned now, all of them having seen, none of them moving. Margaret looked at the torn dress with that same constructed pleasantness. "Oh," she said with theatrical concern. "How unfortunate. These old things do just fall apart, don't they?" Dottie made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh before she thought better of it and converted it into something else. Hazel looked at Margaret. She didn't cry. She was very clear about that with herself in the moment. She was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of this woman, and this street, and all these watching faces. What she felt was not sadness. What she felt was a cold, clarifying fury that started at the base of her spine and moved upward, and it was the kind of fury that doesn't make you loud or wild. It makes you extremely, dangerously quiet. "That dress," Hazel said, "took me 11 evenings to sew. It's the only one I have. You know that." Margaret's expression didn't change. "And you planned this," Hazel said. "You told them where to stand. You timed it. You stood on a public street and you destroyed my property, and you think—" She stopped. Her voice had stayed level through all of it. She was genuinely surprised by that. "You think because no one is going to stop you, that means you're right." "I think," Margaret said, "that some people need to understand where they stand." "And where do I stand?" "Somewhere you were not invited," Margaret said, and there was no pleasantness left in her voice now, just the cold, stripped fact of what she thought. "This community has a character, a reputation, and women who look as you look, who arrive with nothing, who push themselves into spaces they don't belong." "Stop." The voice was not Hazel's. It came from the street, and it was quiet in the way that certain sounds are quiet. Not soft, but contained, the way a fire is contained that could easily be otherwise. And it carried in the way that quiet voices sometimes carry farther than loud ones. Every head on Main Street turned. Silas Boone had not announced himself. He had ridden into Iron Ridge at the pace of a man who was in no hurry because he had already decided what he was going to do, and he had pulled Franklin up at the edge of the gathering without anyone noticing because they'd all been watching Margaret, and he had heard enough. He dismounted. He was not a man who made an entrance, and he didn't make one now. He simply got off his horse and walked into the space between Margaret and Hazel with the same unhurried certainty he'd had in his own clearing, in his own cabin, on his own mountain. The certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is and has decided not to be moved. He was wearing his buckskin shirt. He was not, Hazel noticed with some part of her brain that was functioning on a separate track, wearing his coat, which meant he had ridden down from the mountain fast enough that he hadn't wanted the extra weight. He looked at the torn shoulder of Hazel's dress for one moment. Just one. Then he pulled the buckskin shirt over his head. The street was completely silent. He held the shirt out to Hazel. She took it. She was so surprised that she took it purely on reflex, and then she was holding this large, worn, still warm buckskin shirt in her hands, and Silas Boone was standing on Main Street bare-chested in the November cold without appearing to notice or care. "Put it on," he said to Hazel quietly. "It's cold." She put it on. It was enormous on her, came down past her hips, the sleeves hanging past her hands, and she pushed the sleeves up, and her ruined dress was covered. And the cold air was gone, and she stood there in Silas Boone's shirt on the main street of Iron Ridge, and she did not feel ridiculous. She felt oddly steadier than she had felt in the last 4 minutes. Silas turned to Margaret. Margaret had not moved. To her credit, if credit was applicable here, she had not flinched either. She stood her ground with her chin level and that constructed expression still in place, though it had developed a hairline crack somewhere around the eyes. "I know who you are," Silas said, not loudly. "Margaret Hollis. You run the dress shop. You run a good portion of what passes for social structure in this town." He looked at Dottie, then at Vera, and each of them received about 2 seconds of his attention, which was enough to make both of them take a small, involuntary step backward. "And I know what just happened here." "Mr. Boone," Margaret said, "this is a private—" There are 15 people on this street, Silas said. This stopped being private when you chose to do it here. Margaret's jaw tightened. This woman has been pushing herself into the business of this community without invitation. She carried 110 pounds of supplies up 3 hours of mountain trail in November, Silas said. She did something your husbands and your hired men were too afraid to attempt. She did it because she needed the work and she had the capability, and she didn't ask anyone's permission, which seems to be the part that bothers you. That is not, and she has never once, in the time I've known her, done a single thing to you. He said this without particular heat, which made it worse, Hazel thought, than if he'd said it angrily. She has not interfered with your business. She has not spoken against your family. She has existed in this town and done her work and minded her own affairs, and you have spent 7 weeks trying to make that into a problem. Margaret said nothing. Her face had gone through several careful arrangements and settled, finally, into something that was trying to be contempt, but was working too hard at it. I want to say something else, Silas said, and here he raised his voice slightly, not shouting, but projecting, the way a man projects when he wants what he's saying to reach everyone within distance rather than just the person in front of him. I want to say it so that everyone standing on this street hears it and remembers they heard it. He turned so that he was facing not just Margaret, but the whole visible reach of Main Street. Harvey on his bench, the 2 men by the wagon, the woman outside the laundry, all of them, every watching face. Hazel Rowan is the most capable person who has come into this town in the years I've been aware of it, he said. She is honest, she is fair, she works harder than she's ever been given credit for, and she keeps her word, and she does not complain. And she has more actual dignity in that dress you just tore than any of the people who thought it was acceptable to stand by and watch this happen without opening their mouths. That last part landed on the watching crowd differently than the rest. Hazel felt it, the slight collective shift, the way certain faces changed, as if they'd been looking at something from one angle and now saw the other side of it. Harvey Spence, on his bench, looked at his hands. The woman outside the laundry looked away. Tom Riddle, who had appeared at some point during the confrontation and was standing near the general store with his arms folded, did not look away. Silas looked back at Margaret. If anyone in this town harms her again, he said, in any way, her property, her livelihood, her standing, her person, they will have me to speak to about it, directly. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time, not so long as to be theatrical, not so short as to be dismissible. I think I'm understood. Margaret Hollis stood in front of Silas Boone and understood that the social calculus of this moment had not gone the way she'd designed it, and that redesigning it in real time on a public street was not something she had the tools for right now. She understood this with the clarity of a very intelligent woman who has just made a miscalculation, and understanding it made her more dangerous in the long run. But for right now, in this moment, it meant she had nothing to say. She turned and walked back into her shop. Dottie and Vera followed, one and then the other, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that hadn't gone where it was meant to go. The door closed. The street breathed. Chester Doyle came out of the general store with a look on his face that Hazel could only describe as a man coming out the other side of a feeling he hadn't expected to have. He went up to Silas first, said something low that Hazel couldn't hear, and Silas nodded once. Then Chester turned to Hazel, and he said, "Come inside." She looked at Silas. "Go on," he said. Inside the store, Chester moved behind the counter with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it before he second-guesses himself. He started pulling fabric from the shelf behind him. 2 lengths of wool flannel, one dark blue, one a warm brown, quality material, not the cheapest he stocked. "Take these," he said, setting them on the counter. Chester, "Don't argue." He added thread, a packet of needles, 2 bone buttons. "And I've got a coat in the back that came in on the supply wagon last month, woman's size. It hasn't sold because we don't get a lot of that size through here." He looked at her steadily. "It's yours if you want it." Hazel put both hands on the counter. Her fingers were gripping the edge, which was the only outward sign she would allow herself of what was happening inside her chest, which was something seismic and complicated that she didn't have language for yet. I don't want charity, she said. It's not charity. Chester's voice was flat. I stood outside on my own boardwalk and watched what just happened, and I didn't say a word. This is me saying a word about a week too late and in the wrong language, and I know that. He held her gaze. It's not charity. It's me doing the thing I should have been doing for 7 weeks, which is treating you like any other person who came to this town and worked and paid their bills and deserved to be left alone. Hazel looked at the fabric. The blue one was nicer than anything she'd worn in 3 years. The coat, too, Chester said. Go on, take it. She took it. When she came back out, Silas was at the water trough with Franklin, who was drinking with the unhurried authority of a horse that travels at his own pace and knows it. Silas had put on his coat, which had been tied to the back of Franklin's saddle, and was watching the horse drink with the patient attention of a man who has nowhere urgent to be. Hazel came to stand beside him. She was still wearing his buckskin shirt over her ruined dress, the coat Chester had given her folded over her arm, the fabric and notions in a paper parcel under her other arm. Thank you, she said. He didn't look at her right away. He looked at Franklin. You don't need to thank me. I think I do. You were handling it. I was standing in a torn dress on a public street, she said. I was handling it as well as it can be handled, which has limits. Silas was quiet for a moment. Franklin lifted his head from the trough, water dripping from his muzzle, and then went back to drinking. I came down for supplies, Silas said. I was going to be in town this afternoon regardless. You saw what was happening. I heard her voice, he said, and then I heard yours, and then I heard the dress tear. A pause. I know what that sound means when it happens in a situation like that one. Hazel looked at him. How do you know that? He turned to look at her then, and something in his face was more open than she'd seen it. Not vulnerable exactly, but less defended. Because I knew someone it happened to before, he said quietly. A long time ago. In a different place. And I wasn't there for it, and I should have been, and I was never... He stopped. I was in a position to have done something, and I wasn't there to do it. She didn't ask who. She understood that the letter from the post, the one that had been sitting at Chester's for 6 weeks, the one he'd set aside with that particular careful motion, was connected to what he'd just said, and she understood that asking about it was not something she was going to do, at least not today. Well, she said, you were here today. Yes, he said, I was here today. Franklin finished drinking and raised his head and shook it once, drops scattering, and Silas patted his neck with the automatic, unbothered affection of a man who has been touching that horse's neck for 3 years. You said I was the most capable person to come into this town, Hazel said. I said it because it's true. You've been in the high country for 4 years. You don't have a wide sample. The corner of his mouth moved. It was almost a smile, the kind of almost smile that is more genuine than a full one because it didn't decide ahead of time to be there. Wide enough, he said. Hazel looked down the street. The wagon that had been loading was gone. Harvey was still on his bench, but he was looking at the ground now. Tom Riddle was leaning against the general storefront, and when Hazel looked at him, he gave a single nod. Small, direct, nothing fancy about it. She nodded back. What happens now? She said, mostly to herself. What do you want to happen? Silas said. She thought about it, about the fabric in the parcel, about the coat, about the letter in her pocket from her mother's sister, which she still hadn't read properly, which might be nothing or might be something she didn't know yet. I want to stay, she said. I want to keep doing the deliveries. I want to fix the back fence at Abernathy's because I told her I would, and I have a plan for it. I want to make a dress that fits me properly and doesn't have to be held together by careful movement and hope. She paused. I want to not have to think about Margaret Hollis every time I walk down this street. Silas considered this. The last part is up to her, he said. But she knows now that there are consequences to what she does. That's different from before. You think she'll let it go? No, he said without hesitation. But she'll be more careful about what she tries. And more careful means slower. And slower means you have time to build something here before she makes her next move. He looked at Hazel. Time is what you need most right now. That's practical. I'm a practical person. I know, she said. I've noticed that about you. She had dinner at the boarding house that night, the regular dinner that Mrs. Abernathy put on for her lodgers. Boiled beef and root vegetables and bread that was slightly better than usual, which Hazel suspected was Mrs. Abernathy's version of acknowledgement. She ate without talking much, which the other lodgers seemed to understand, and Webb the surveyor refilled her water glass without being asked, which was a small thing that registered anyway. After dinner, alone in her room, she read the letter from her mother's sister. It was 3 paragraphs. The first was about the sister's health, which was middling. The second was a careful, non-committal expression of interest in Hazel's situation, which was not the same as concern, but was a step in that direction. The third said, "Your mother always said you had more iron in you than people gave you credit for. I am beginning to think she was right." Hazel folded the letter and put it in the tin box where she kept important things, alongside the $7 she hadn't spent yet, and her mother's scissors, and the $3.40 she'd started with, which she'd never touched, which she was not sure she ever would touch, because they were the number she'd arrived with, and there was something in her that needed to know she'd never gone below it. She spread the blue wool flannel out on the bed. It was good quality. Heavy, tight weave, would hold a seam and keep its shape. She ran her hand over it and thought about the pattern she would cut, and the adjustments she would make. Not just to fit, but to work in, to move in, to carry things and climb trails and do the actual tasks of her actual life without strain or apology. She got out her mother's scissors. She thought about Silas standing on Main Street with no shirt on in November, and the particular quality of his voice when he'd said, "I think I'm understood," which was the voice of a man who was certain of a thing not because he was powerful, but because he was committed to it, and those are different kinds of certainty. She thought about what he'd said about someone he knew, a long time ago, in a different place. She thought about the letter that had sat at Chester's for 6 weeks. She thought, he came down that mountain for supplies, and he saw what was happening, and he got off his horse, and he gave a woman he'd met 4 times the shirt off his back in November, and he made it look like the most ordinary thing in the world. She picked up the scissors. She started cutting. The room was quiet and cold and lit by the one lamp Mrs. Abernathy allowed per lodger, and outside the window, Iron Ridge settled into its nighttime sounds. A horse somewhere, a door, someone's dog with something to say about the dark. And Hazel Rowan sat on the edge of her narrow bed and made herself a dress. It took 4 hours. It was not perfect. The left sleeve ran slightly shorter than the right, and one of the seams at the hip puckered in a way she'd have to press out in the morning. But it fit. It fit her body as it actually was, not as it was supposed to be or used to be or might someday become. And when she held it up in the lamplight, it was the dark blue of deep water, and it was hers, in a way that the brown dress had been hers. And the difference was that the brown dress had been made in grief, in necessity, in the particular economy of someone who has nothing to spare. This one was made in something else. She couldn't entirely name it yet, but it was something else. She put out the lamp, lay down, and slept without difficulty, which was not something she had always been able to do, and which meant she had learned that something in her had found temporary solid ground. Tomorrow she would fix the fence at the boarding house. Next week she would make the 5th delivery. The week after that, she didn't know yet. But 7 weeks ago she had arrived in Iron Ridge with $3.40 and 1 dress and no room and a cousin who wouldn't look her in the eye. And tonight she had a room with a morning window and a new dress and a man on a mountain who had said, clearly and publicly and in front of everyone, that she was worth defending. It wasn't everything, but she had always known how to build from what was there. Part 4. A New Beginning in the Mountains. The fence took 2 days. Hazel had told Mrs. Abernathy she had a plan for it, and the plan turned out to be more involved than a plan usually is once you're actually doing the thing rather than thinking about it. 3 of the rear posts were rotted below the soil line, which she didn't discover until she started pulling at the leaning sections, and the whole east corner came away in her hands with the quiet disgrace of something that had been pretending to stand up for longer than it could sustain. She had to re-dig the post holes by hand, which was hard going in soil that had gone cold and compacted, and she had to ask Chester Doyle for 3 replacement posts which he gave her without charging for them. And she had to borrow a mallet from Tom Riddle because the one at the boarding house was cracked through the handle in a way that made it more dangerous than useful. Tom came with the mallet and stayed to help set the posts, which she hadn't asked for but didn't refuse. He worked without commentary, handing her things when she needed them, holding the post plumb while she tamped the soil, and generally making himself useful in the way of someone who has grown up understanding that useful is better than decorative. "You're going up the mountain next week," he said, on the second afternoon while she was re-nailing the rails. "Tuesday," she confirmed. "Weather's supposed to come in Wednesday." "Then I'll be glad I'm going Tuesday." He was quiet for a moment, handing her nails from the can she'd set on the post beside her. "What's it like up there? Really?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Quiet," she said. "The real kind. Not the kind that means nothing is happening. The kind that means you can hear what's actually there." Tom considered this. "And Boone? What about him?" "I don't know. People talk about him like he's—" Tom searched for the word. "Like he's a force of nature more than a person. But you talk about him like he's just a man." "He is just a man," Hazel said. "A particular one. But just a man." "A particular one," Tom repeated, with the faint suggestion that he was filing this away for later examination. Then he handed her another nail and didn't push it further, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about Tom Riddle. He knew when a subject had been as far developed as it was going to go in a given conversation. The fence was done by Wednesday morning. It was not a beautiful fence, but it was a solid one, plumb and tight and built to last through whatever the winter had planned. Mrs. Abernathy came out to look at it with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted, and she said, "That's a better fence than the original," which was not effusive but was as close to it as Mrs. Abernathy generally traveled. "The original had bad posts," Hazel said. "The original was put in by my husband," Mrs. Abernathy said, "and he was better at talking about things than doing them, rest his soul." She looked at the fence a moment longer. "Your rate stays reduced through spring." It was more than Hazel had negotiated for. She accepted it without argument. What? The fifth delivery was on a Tuesday, as planned, with a sky that looked exactly like a sky that is thinking about doing something significant and hasn't quite decided what. Agnes moved well on the trail. They had a routine now, the two of them, which was not warmth exactly, but a functional understanding of each other's rhythms and preferences, which Agnes had made clear was as far as she intended to take the relationship. Silas was in the clearing when Hazel came out of the timber, this time not splitting wood but working on something at the porch. A piece of ironwork clamped in a vise he'd mounted to the porch rail, and he was filing it with the focused, methodical attention he gave to most physical tasks. He looked up, noted the sky, and then Hazel, and then Agnes's load, and set down the file. "Early weather coming," he said, by way of greeting. "I know. I'll turn back quickly." He took the heavier pannier without discussion. Inside, she noted that the open book on the work table was different again. This time something with diagrams, technical drawings of some kind, though she didn't have time to look closely. The fire was burning higher than usual, the cabin warm enough that she felt the cold she'd been carrying on the trail release from her shoulders. He paid her. $10, exact, the tin box open, and the bills counted with the same no-ceremony efficiency as always. And then he did something he hadn't done in the previous deliveries. He didn't immediately move to repack the outgoing goods. He poured 2 coffees and sat down. Hazel sat down across from him. "I heard what happened on Main Street," he said. "You were there for part of it." "The part before." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "I heard from Chester when I came in for supplies last week. He told me the whole of it, not just what I saw." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry I wasn't there from the beginning." "You don't need to apologize for something you didn't do." "I'm not apologizing for what I did. He stopped, reconsidered. "I'm saying I wish I had been there sooner. There's a difference." Hazel looked at him. The light through the small window was flat and gray, the early weather pushing the sky down, and in that light Silas looked both older and younger than he usually seemed. The tiredness was there, the years he carried in the set of his jaw and the lines around his eyes, but there was something else underneath it today, something that was paying close attention. "Silas," she said carefully. The letter. He didn't react. His hands stayed where they were on the mug, but she felt the change in the air between them, the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a subject to arrive and is now deciding how to meet it. You don't have to tell me anything, she said. I know. But you want to. A pause. I've been thinking about it. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the wind was picking up, the first real push of the coming weather moving through the pines. Her name was Ruth, he said. Just that to begin with. Setting the name down in the room like you'd set down something fragile, carefully, with both hands making sure it was stable before you let go. My wife. We had a son, James. He was 4. He looked at the fire. This was 11 years ago, before the war, but only just. Hazel said nothing because there was nothing to say yet. I was away when the fever came through the valley, he said. I was working a contract job 3 counties east, supposed to be gone 6 weeks. It was longer. By the time I got back, he stopped. His jaw worked. James went first. Ruth held on for another 2 weeks, but she was already gone in the ways that mattered by the time I got home. The room was very still. I got the letter, he said, and now she understood the 6-week-old letter on the table. From Ruth's sister. She writes every few years, checking on me, she says. His voice was even, almost flat, the way voices go flat when they're carrying too much weight to afford inflection. She had a son this spring, named him James. Hazel set down her mug. She wrote to tell me, she said. She wrote to tell me. He looked at Hazel then, directly, and his eyes were tired in a way that went past physical tired into something structural, the tiredness of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for so long that he's organized his entire self around it. I don't know what I feel about it. That's the honest truth. I read it, and I put it down, and I didn't know what to do with what it made me feel. You don't have to do anything with it, Hazel said. Not right away. I know. A pause. I've been out here 4 years, and I'm good at knowing what I think about things that have to do with this place. The mountain, the work, what needs doing. I'm good at that. He turned the mug slowly in his hands. I'm less good at the other parts. Most people are, she said. You're not. She looked at him. What makes you think that? Because I watched you stand in a torn dress on a public street and hold your ground, and you knew exactly what you felt about it. You were furious, and you were clear, and you didn't fall apart, and you didn't pretend. He met her eyes. That's not common. I fall apart in private, she said. After. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recognition. Everyone does, he said. Yes, she said, but some people can only do it in private. I've learned that's not weakness. It's just the order of operations. He sat with that for a moment. She named her son James, he said again quietly. She loved her sister, Hazel said, and she loves you. That's what naming means. Silas looked at her for a long moment, and she let herself be looked at, because he wasn't looking at her the way most people looked at her, not cataloging deficiencies or measuring her against some standard she hadn't agreed to be measured by. He was looking at her the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, that patient, direct attention she'd noticed from the first day. Stay for lunch, he said. She blinked. The weather will hold another 2 hours. I can read the sky. He stood up. I have salt pork and I made bread yesterday. It's not going to win any prizes, but it's better than nothing. You make bread. Winters are long, he said, for the second time she'd heard him say it, which meant it was his explanation for more things than just the books. She stayed for lunch. Chet. The bread was dense and slightly too salty, which she ate without comment. The salt pork was fine. They sat at the work table with the diagrams pushed to the side and ate without the kind of conversation that fills silence for its own sake, which was, Hazel had come to understand, one of the things she valued most about being in this particular company. She had spent her whole life in the presence of people who needed noise the way other people needed air, and the quiet that Silas carried with him, not cold, not closed, just genuinely at rest, was something she hadn't known she was hungry for until she'd started finding it up here. What are the drawings? She said, nodding at the diagrams. He pulled the top sheet toward her. I'm planning to expand the cabin. There's a section on the south wall where the logs need replacing anyway. It makes more sense to take the wall out and extend than to patch it. He traced the drawing with one finger. Longer workroom, better storage. If I'm going to winter the amount of supplies I'm going through, I need more controlled space for them. She looked at the drawings. They were precise, detailed. The kind of drawings that come from someone who thinks in 3 dimensions and can translate it onto flat paper, which is a specific skill not everyone has. You drew these yourself, she said. I built the cabin myself, same principle. From scratch? No help? Franklin helped, he said, and she could hear the near smile in it, and that he stood nearby and watched, which I found encouraging. She laughed. It came out before she'd decided to laugh, which was the best kind. The kind that doesn't wait for your permission. Silas looked at her when she laughed, the way he'd looked at her when she'd said his name at the start of the conversation, like something that had arrived unexpectedly and was being carefully noted. You should laugh more, he said. I'll have more to laugh about, she said, when more things are funny. Fair? She looked back at the drawings. The extended workroom made practical sense, but she could also see, now that she'd been in the cabin enough times to know its limitations, that what he was really building was not more storage space. He was building room, for the possibility of more than one person occupying the space without it becoming impossible. She didn't say this. Instead, she said, the south wall extension, you'll want to think about the snow load on that new roof line. The pitch looks shallow. Silas looked at the drawing, then looked at her. What's your background in construction? My father built our house. I was the one who handed him things, then the one who did what he told me, then the one he asked opinions of when his back got bad and he needed to think out loud. She studied the drawing. That pitch is going to give you trouble in a heavy snow year. You'd want to steepen it at least 10 degrees. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the pencil lying beside the drawings and extended it toward her without comment. She took it and made the adjustment on the drawing, changing the roof pitch with a few clean lines, adding a note about the rafter spacing. He looked at it for a long moment. Better, he said. You'd have figured it out, she said. Probably, but this is faster. She put the pencil down. Outside, the wind had stepped up another degree, the pines beginning their serious winter voice. Hazel looked at the small window and the quality of the light and calculated. I need to go, she said. He nodded, already standing. He had the outgoing panniers ready. She hadn't watched him pack them, but they were done, organized with the same efficient care as always. He loaded Agnes while Hazel wrapped herself in her coat and pulled on her gloves. The deer trail, he said, checking a strap. All the way. Don't try to cut back to the main track before the creek. I know. The wind is from the northwest. That means the trees on the upper slope are going to be... Silas. She said it with patience, not impatience. I've done this 5 times. He stopped checking the strap. Right, he said. She gathered Agnes's lead rope. The drawings, he said, as she started for the timber. The roof pitch. Could you... A pause. He was not a man who had to work to find words generally, but he was working now. She could hear it. If I had further questions about the construction. Hazel turned and looked at him. He was standing by Agnes's flank in the gray light with his hand still on the last strap he'd checked, and he looked for just a moment like a man standing at the edge of something he's been looking at for a long time from a careful distance. I'll be back in 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he said. She went into the timber. Maison. She thought about it for the entire 2 weeks. Not obsessively. She had enough actual tasks to keep obsession at bay. But it ran underneath everything the way certain things run underneath, surfacing at odd moments. When she was at the laundry, which she still worked twice a week. When she was in her room at night with her needle and thread, making small repairs to the blue dress that had turned out to need more finishing work than she'd given it. When she was walking Main Street and having the particular experience of walking it differently than she had 7 weeks ago, which was something she was still calibrating. The street had changed, or her relationship to it had. Not completely, not cleanly. Nothing in life changes completely or cleanly, and anyone who told you different was selling something. Margaret Hollis had not come back to Hazel directly. She was still in her shop, still present in the social architecture of Iron Ridge, still running the currents that she ran. But the quality of her attention toward Hazel had changed. It was still watchful. It was now also wary in a way it hadn't been before, which Hazel recognized as the specific wariness of a person who has made a move and had it cost them something unexpected, and has not yet decided what to do about that. What had actually shifted in the tangible fabric of daily life were the smaller things. Harvey Spence said hello to her now. Said it first, which was the meaningful part. The woman whose name turned out to be Eliza Pierce, who worked at the laundry, had started taking her break at the same time as Hazel's break, which happened naturally enough over 3 shifts that it didn't feel like a decision so much as a pattern they'd both arrived at. Webb the surveyor had asked her opinion on a property boundary question, not because she was an expert, but because he'd seen her looking at his maps on the boarding house table and had intuited correctly that she could read them. She could read them. Her father had taught her. She'd spent enough time looking at the terrain around Iron Ridge and its relationship to the distant mountain that she had a better instinctive grasp of the survey questions than Webb had expected. And the conversation that followed had been the best one she'd had in the town yet, because it was about something real, and she'd been able to contribute something real to it. She told Mrs. Abernathy about it that evening in the kitchen after dinner. "Webb is impressed," Mrs. Abernathy said, scrubbing a pot with the focused attention she gave everything. "He was polite about it." Webb is always polite. He was also surprised, which is different from polite and more meaningful. Mrs. Abernathy set the pot down and turned. "You're finding your footing here." "Trying to." "It's not trying anymore." She looked at Hazel directly, which she didn't always do. Mrs. Abernathy was a woman of oblique communication, generally fond of saying things sideways. But sometimes she went straight. "You're building something. I can see the shape of it starting." Hazel considered that. "It doesn't feel built. It feels precarious." "Everything feels precarious when you're in the middle of building it," Mrs. Abernathy said. "The fence felt precarious when the posts were in and the rails weren't on yet, but you kept going. The fence is not a life." "No, but the principle's the same." She picked the pot back up. "Boone comes to town again next week?" "Tuesday. I go up Tuesday." Mrs. Abernathy returned to scrubbing with an expression that was carefully not saying anything. "What?" Hazel said. "Nothing." "That's not a nothing face." Mrs. Abernathy set the pot down again with the patience of a woman who has decided to say the thing she was going to say anyway. "He's been to town 4 times since the incident on Main Street," she said. "Twice for supplies from Chester, once with a load of cured hides for the trader, and once, last Thursday, when as far as anyone could see, he had no particular business in town at all and bought 1 small item from Chester and left." She looked at Hazel with the calm attention of a woman who notices things. "He went past this boarding house on the way out, slow." Hazel looked at her hands. "I'm just saying what I observed," Mrs. Abernathy said, and went back to the pot. The 6th delivery was clear and cold and sharp in the way of winter days that have decided to be beautiful instead of brutal, and the trail was hard-packed and dry enough that Agnes moved well, even on the upper section. Hazel arrived at the cabin in just under 3 hours, which was her best time, and when she came out of the timber, Silas was already outside. Not from anticipation, but because he'd been working. The south wall had been opened up, the old logs removed, new footings visible in the raw ground at the base, the project begun. "You started," she said, "last week." He came to help with the panniers, glancing at the opened wall with the expression of a man who is both satisfied with his progress and aware of how much remains. "I kept the pitch adjustment you made." "It's the right call." "I know. I looked at it from every angle I could think of for 3 days before I started cutting." "And?" "And you were right," he said simply. No performance around it, just a fact acknowledged. She helped him unload and restock, and they fell into the routine of it. Efficient, comfortable, the kind of comfort that comes from having done something enough times together that the choreography is internalized. But today, after the coffee, he didn't move toward the outgoing panniers right away. He sat with his mug and looked at the opened south wall from inside, where the cold air came through the gap in a steady, deliberate draft. I've been thinking, he said. About the construction? About a number of things. He turned the mug in his hands. I've been alone up here for 4 years. When I came up, I thought I was too broken to be in anyone's company for any length of time. He said broken the way you'd say any other accurate word, without apology or drama. I'd lost things and I'd done things in the war, and I came up here because there was nowhere else I fit. And now, Hazel said, now I think... He stopped, started again because he was a man who started again when the first attempt hadn't said the true thing. Now I think I confuse needing solitude with needing to be punished, and those aren't the same. Hazel set down her mug. I'm not saying I've worked that out entirely, he said, with the particular precision of someone who doesn't want to overstate a thing. I'm saying I'm starting to see the difference. Outside, a jay landed on the porch rail and considered the interior of the cabin with bright, imperious eyes, then left. Franklin moved in the lean-to, a shift of weight and the dull sound of a hoof. What made you start seeing it? Hazel said. He looked at her. You know what made me start seeing it. She did know. She didn't look away from it. I want to show you something, he said. He stood up and pulled his coat from the peg. Come outside. She followed him out and around the cabin to the north side, where the mountain continued to rise behind the homestead, and he walked her up a short, steep path she hadn't noticed before, maybe 100 feet above the cabin, where the timber opened onto a shelf of rock that faced west and south. The view from that shelf was... She had no word for it that didn't feel inadequate. The valley spread below in its winter colors, gray and gold and dark green, the creek catching light in the low places, the far ridges blue with distance, and above it all a sky of absolute clarity, the kind of sky that only exists in cold, clean air at elevation. They stood there without speaking for a long moment. I come up here in the evenings sometimes, Silas said, when the light is going. He was standing beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the cold air. I don't have a good word for what it does. It reminds you that it's bigger, Hazel said. All of it. Whatever you're carrying, it's big, but this is bigger. Yes, he said. That's it exactly. She looked at the valley and felt it working on her the way he'd described. Not erasing anything, not solving anything, but putting it in proportion. The distance from which Iron Ridge was visible, from up here, told you something about the distance from which things that had felt enormous in town could be perceived as their actual size. Silas, she said. Yes. Ask me. A pause. He turned to look at her. I've been watching you work out how to say something for 3 weeks, she said. I can see it the way you can see that weather coming. Not the thing itself, but the shape of the air around it. She held his gaze. Ask me. He was quiet for a moment that was not hesitant, but was very careful, the care of a man who has decided to mean every word. Would you come up and spend a few days, he said. Here, at the homestead. Not to deliver, not to work. He paused. Just to be here. See what it's like, see if it's... Another pause. See if it suits you. The valley below was doing what it always did, indifferent to what two people were saying on a rock shelf above it. A hawk moved in the middle distance, riding something invisible. The construction, Hazel said. The south wall extension. Yes. You have enough lumber for the new framing. Most of it. I need to have 2 more loads brought up. The roof pitch adjustment is going to change your rafter count. You'll need... She looked at the shape of the cabin below them, calculating. At least 4 more rafters than your original plan. I know. I could help, she said. With the framing. I know how it goes together. Silas looked at her. I'm not agreeing because of the construction, she said clearly. I know that too, he said. I'm agreeing because I want to know what it's like, she said, to be in a place where the quiet is real and the work is honest and the person you're with doesn't look at you and see a problem to be managed. His jaw tightened slightly. Once, not from anything bad, she thought, but from the impact of hearing a true thing said plainly. That won't be a problem here, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm saying yes. She came up the following Friday, with Agnes carrying a smaller load than usual. Her own things, a few additional tools Mrs. Abernathy had lent her without asking detailed questions, and a covered dish from Mrs. Abernathy herself, pressed into Hazel's hands at the boarding house door with the instruction to return the dish clean and no other commentary. 3 days on the mountain. Later, trying to find words for what those 3 days were, she would fall short every time, which she eventually decided meant they were the kind of thing that didn't resolve into language. What she could say was specific and true. They worked on the south wall extension every morning until the light got difficult, and the work was genuinely good. Not perfect. Nothing is perfect. They had to redo one section of the framing when the green timber twisted in a direction neither of them had anticipated, and there was an afternoon where the fit of a corner joint was wrong 3 times before it was right, and Silas said something under his breath on the 3rd failed attempt that she pretended not to hear. The work was honest and physical, and something emerged from it each day that hadn't existed the day before, which was the thing she had always found most satisfying about construction, that fundamental accumulation. They ate at the work table in the evenings. He cooked, because she didn't know where things were, and because he turned out to have opinions about the preparation of salt pork that he'd developed over 4 winters of solitary meals, and was willing, it turned out, to share. She washed up. These were not negotiated arrangements. They arrived at them the way you arrive at things that fit, not by deciding, but by doing. The second evening she asked him about the war, not the worst of it. She didn't ask about that because she already knew, from the way he carried it, that it was there and that it was not for asking about yet. She asked about before, where he'd been, what he'd done, the shape of the years. He told her. She told him about Caldwell County, about her father's farm, about the years after her mother died when she'd moved from place to place, taking work where she could find it, about what it did to a person's sense of themselves to be consistently treated as a problem in need of solution rather than a person in need of opportunity. "You didn't let it take you," he said. "I came close," she said, "once. There was a winter. I was in Millhaven, working at a tannery, and I thought about just—" She stopped. About stopping. Not doing anything to stop. Just stopping trying. He listened to this without filling the silence with quick reassurance, which was the right thing to do. "What changed?" he said. "Spring came," she said. "That's all. Spring came and it was warm and there was work and I got up one morning and the thing that had felt permanent the night before felt like something that had passed through." She looked at the fire. "It's strange how much weight a season can carry." "It's not strange," he said. "Seasons are real. The way they feel is real." On the 3rd morning, she went up to the rock shelf alone, early, before Silas was up, and she sat on the cold stone and looked at the valley in the first light, and she allowed herself to understand something that she'd been approaching from careful angles for several weeks. She was happy. Not in a dramatic, completed way. Not the happiness of a story that has resolved. The happiness of a direction. Of a set of conditions that, when she was inside them, made her feel like herself rather than like someone who was managing the gap between who she was and who the world wanted her to be. She heard him on the path behind her, the specific sound of his boots on the rock, and she didn't turn around until he'd sat down beside her on the shelf, close, their shoulders almost touching in the cold morning air. They looked at the valley together. "I don't want to go back down today," she said, not as a complaint, just as a true thing. "Then stay another day," he said. She looked at him. "Mrs. Abernathy won't worry," he said. "She strikes me as a woman who understands the situation." "She does," Hazel said. "She definitely does." The hawk was back in the valley below, or a different hawk, riding the same invisible thing. "Silas," she said. "Yes." "When the south wall is finished, and the roof line is done and the rafters are right." She looked at the valley. "What comes after that?" He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him, and he was looking not at the valley, but at her, with that direct reading attention. "I have ideas about that," he said, "if you're interested in hearing them." "I'm interested," she said. He nodded once, and they sat together on the cold rock in the early light, above everything, with the day not yet decided and the hawk below them doing what hawks do, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because the silence between them had stopped being empty and become something else entirely, something that required no filling, no management, no performance. It just was, and that for both of them was new. Part 5. The Legend of Iron Ridge. He asked her on a Tuesday, not on the rock shelf, as she might have imagined, not with the valley spread below them and the hawk riding the air currents and the sky doing something cinematically appropriate. It happened in the middle of the afternoon in the half-finished south wall extension where they were fitting the last section of new framing, and the corner joint had given them trouble for the better part of an hour. Hazel had her shoulder against a beam, holding it plumb, while Silas drove the pin, and she was thinking about the angle of the brace and whether the spacing was right, and he drove the last pin home and stepped back to check the vertical and said, without preamble, without clearing his throat or choosing a moment, "I want you to stay, permanently, as my wife." Hazel kept her hand on the beam. She looked at the joint they'd just set. It was right. After an hour of it being wrong 3 different ways, it was finally right. "All right," she said. Silas looked at her. "All right?" "Yes." She checked the vertical herself from her angle. "You'll want to add a diagonal brace here before we move on. This section is going to get a lot of snow load." A pause. "Hazel." "I said yes, Silas." She looked at him then, straight on. "I meant it. The brace is also a real concern." He looked at her for a moment with that reading expression, and then the almost smile came. The real one. The one that didn't decide ahead of time to be there. And he went to get the brace material without another word, which was, she had come to understand, his version of being moved by something. They finished the framing that afternoon. The diagonal brace went in square and solid, and the new roof line sat at the corrected pitch she'd drawn in pencil on his original plans. And when they stepped back from the completed shell of the extension and looked at it in the late flat light, it was not beautiful. In the way that finished things are beautiful, but it was right in the way that right things are right, and that was better. "We'll need to roof it before the next heavy snow," she said. 2 weeks, he said. "I can get the shingles up from Chester next delivery." "I'll help." "I know," he said. She turned and walked back inside because her hands were cold and the coffee was still on the fire, and he followed her, and neither of them made any particular ceremony about any of it, because that was the way they were together, and it suited them both down to the ground. She went back to Iron Ridge the next morning to settle things. The phrase settle things covered considerably more than it sounded like. It meant telling Mrs. Abernathy, which she did at breakfast, and which Mrs. Abernathy received with the particular expression of someone who has been watching a situation develop for some months and is not surprised by where it has arrived. "I thought so," Mrs. Abernathy said. "You said nothing." "It wasn't mine to say." She refilled Hazel's coffee. "Your room is yours until the end of the month. You paid through then." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Come back when you're in town. Eat something at this table when you do." She set the pot down. That man has been feeding himself badly for 4 years. You'll both be better for decent cooking." Hazel did not point out that Silas's salt pork had been improving steadily for the past 2 months. She accepted the observation in the spirit it was offered. It meant telling Tom Riddle, who heard the news with the open, uncalculating face of someone who is straightforwardly glad about something. "Good," he said. "That's genuinely good, Hazel." "Don't make it a production," she said. "I'm not making it a production. I'm saying it's good." He shrugged. "It is good. Some things just are." She had no argument for that. It meant finding Chester Doyle and telling him that the delivery arrangement would be changing. She would still handle the mountain runs, but the logistics would simplify considerably, and he would have a more reliable arrangement than he'd had before. Chester sat with this for a moment, then leaned on his counter and looked at her with the expression of a man taking a genuine accounting of something. "When you walked in here 10 weeks ago asking about that notice," he said, "I thought—" He stopped. "I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong." "Most people did," she said, without particular bitterness. "I should have—" "Chester." She held up a hand. "You gave me the job when no one else would. You gave me fabric when you didn't have to. You told the truth about what happened on Main Street when people asked." She looked at him steadily. "That's enough. You don't need to inventory the rest." He nodded. He looked relieved, which she found humanly understandable, if not entirely earned. "The deliveries," he said, returning to business, which was his natural register. "I'll adjust the arrangement. Standing order, monthly. I'll have it ready on Tuesdays." "Make it the first Tuesday of the month," she said. "Gives me time to build a consistent schedule up there." "First Tuesday," he agreed. "And Hazel?" He reached under the counter and brought out a ledger, opened it to a page, and turned it toward her. "I put your name in the account book 2 weeks ago. Official supplier. You get the rate I'd give any contractor who'd done what you've done for this store." She looked at the ledger. Her name was there in Chester's careful hand. H. Rowan, Mountain Courier, rate per trip. It was the first time she'd seen her name in a business ledger. She looked at it for a moment longer than she probably should have. "Thank you," she said. "First Tuesday," Chester said, closing the ledger, because he was a man who processed emotion through transaction, and that was fine. What remained was Margaret Hollis. Hazel had been thinking about this specifically for 3 days. Not with dread exactly, but with the particular focused attention she gave to things that needed to be done correctly and that had real consequences for getting wrong. She had no interest in confrontation. She had no interest in triumph. Both of those things would be performances, and she was done performing for an audience that had already decided what it thought of her. What she had was a need to say something true, in private, once, and then be done with it. She went to the dress shop on a Thursday morning when she knew from pattern observation that Dottie and Vera were unlikely to be there. The shop was quiet when she pushed the door open. The bell above it rang, the neat interior smelled of fabric and cedar, and Margaret Hollis came from the back with the automatic professional expression of someone greeting a customer and then stopped when she saw who it was. They looked at each other across the shop. "Miss Rowan?" Margaret said. Her voice was carefully even. "Mrs. Hollis?" Hazel came in and let the door close behind her. She didn't advance further into the room. She stayed near the door because this wasn't a long conversation, and she wanted Margaret to know that from the start. "I'm not here to fight with you." "Then why are you here?" "I'm going to be living at the Boone homestead," Hazel said, "permanently. I'll be in town regularly for supplies and business and other purposes, and I imagine we'll see each other. I wanted you to hear that from me rather than from the street." Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this. Her face was doing several things simultaneously, which was its way. "I see," she said. "I also want to say—" Hazel paused, not because she was gathering courage, because she wanted to get it right. "What you did on Main Street was wrong. Not wrong because you got caught out. Wrong because you had already decided I wasn't a full person, and that made it easy to treat me like I wasn't. And it's a comfortable thing to decide about someone, because it lets you do whatever you want to them without it costing you anything." She held Margaret's gaze. "But it costs them everything. And you knew that. And you did it anyway." Margaret's jaw was tight. "Miss Rowan." "I'm not asking you to apologize," Hazel said. "I don't want one. You'd give me one that was constructed to manage the situation, and it would mean nothing, and we'd both know it." She kept her voice even, not cold, not warm. Direct, the way Silas was direct, because she had learned from watching him that directness was its own form of respect. "I'm just telling you that I know what you did and why you did it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And I'm staying, and I'm going to build something here, and the best thing, for both of us, is if you leave me alone to do it." The shop was very quiet. Margaret stood in the middle of it with everything she was, but the shop she'd built, the position she'd constructed, the careful architecture of her social authority in this town, arranged around her, and she looked at Hazel with something that had moved past contempt into something more complicated and less comfortable. "You're not afraid of me," Margaret said. It wasn't quite a question. "I was," Hazel said. "At first, you're a woman who knows how to make things difficult for people, and I had nothing to absorb the difficulty with." She glanced around the shop, the neat bolts of fabric, the careful displays, the evidence of genuine skill and genuine work alongside the evidence of genuine cruelty. "You built this. That's real. You know how to run a business and maintain a reputation in a hard place. Those are real things." She looked back at Margaret. "You just decided somewhere along the way that maintaining your position required making other people smaller, and I think—" She stopped. I think that's lonelier than you let on. Something moved across Margaret's face that was there and gone so fast Hazel almost missed it. Almost. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and opened the door, and the bell rang again, and she walked back out into the cold, clear morning air of Main Street and kept walking, and she didn't look back. She would never know exactly what Margaret Hollis did in the quiet of her shop after that door closed. She didn't need to know. Some things you say and then you let them go, because holding on to what they produce is not the same as having said them, and the saying was the part that was yours. They were married in the spring, which arrived that year the way spring arrives in mountain country. Not all at once, but in increments, each one contested, the cold coming back twice after you'd thought it was finished before finally conceding the ground. The ceremony was small. Chester Doyle stood up with Silas. Mrs. Abernathy stood up with Hazel. Tom Riddle came and managed to stay quiet for most of it, which was an act of genuine self-discipline that Hazel appreciated. Harvey Spence came. Eliza Pierce from the laundry came. Webb, the surveyor, came and gave them a framed copy of the survey he'd done of the mountain homestead's boundary, which was, Hazel thought, the most perfectly Webb-like gift imaginable, and she meant that in the best possible way. The justice of the peace read the words, and Silas said what he needed to say with the plainness he gave to true things, and Hazel said what she needed to say, and that was that. Afterward, in the yard behind the boarding house where Mrs. Abernathy had set out tables and a quantity of food that suggested she'd been planning this for longer than anyone had admitted, Tom Riddle said to Hazel, "Are you happy?" with the directness of someone who actually wants to know rather than someone observing a social form. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. And then he went and ate 3 pieces of pie because Tom Riddle's emotional register had a short arc and food was always a reasonable next step. Silas came to stand beside her, holding a cup of coffee that someone had pressed into his hand, watching the small gathering with the expression of a man who is slightly overwhelmed by the presence of this many people in one place after 4 years on a mountain, but who is managing it. "You doing all right?" Hazel said. "I'll survive it," he said. "That's the spirit." He looked at her sideways. "I meant to say it better than that." "I know what you meant," she said. His hand found hers, brief and quiet and not for display, just because it was there and so was hers. And then he returned to his coffee and she returned to whatever conversation had been waiting, and that was how they were. Not performing a marriage, but being in one, which are different activities, and not everyone understands the difference. The homestead in the years that followed became something neither of them had entirely planned and both of them had worked for, which is probably the best description of anything worth having. The south wall extension turned into a proper addition, a full second room, which became necessary sooner than expected. Hazel's organizational instincts, applied to the storage and supply arrangements, reduced their winter shortfalls significantly. Silas's construction ability, directed by a combination of his own considerable skill and Hazel's structural thinking, produced a barn the winter after the wedding, solid and well-planned, with a roofline that handled the mountain snow loads with something approaching contempt. They brought in 2 milk cows the second spring, and chickens the spring after that. And the garden Hazel started on the south-facing slope below the cabin produced more than she'd expected, because the soil there, it turned out, was deep and rich, and had been building itself for decades without anyone to take advantage of it. It was not easy. That is the important thing to say about it, and it is the thing that people who talk about the mountain life from a comfortable distance tend to leave out. It was cold in ways that cold didn't fully capture. There were winters where the snow came in October and didn't leave until April, and the isolation was real and had weight, and there were days when the work required more than either of them felt they had, and they did it anyway because the alternative was watching something they'd built fall apart. There was a winter, the third one, when Silas went 3 weeks without speaking more than 50 words total, and Hazel recognized from the quality of his silence that he was back inside something dark. And she didn't push and didn't panic and didn't pretend it wasn't happening. And on a Tuesday evening in February, she put a lamp on the table between them and said, "Tell me where you are." And he looked at her for a long time and then started talking. And they were up until past midnight, and it was not a tidy conversation, and nothing got resolved the way things only get resolved in stories told by people who haven't actually been through them. But they were both still at the table when the lamp burned low, and that was what mattered. That was what always mattered. Their first child was a daughter, born in the 4th year, in the bedroom of the expanded cabin, with Mrs. Abernathy, who had made the trip up the mountain without complaint. Though it had taken her the better part of a day, and she had opinions about the trail that she expressed at length upon arrival. Attending. They named her Clara. Not after Edmund Hargrove's wife Clara, which might have seemed either generous or strange depending on your perspective, but after Hazel's mother's middle name, which had been Clara, which Hazel had carried quietly for years, and had been waiting for a use for. Silas held the baby with the careful, slightly panicked attentiveness of a man who has not held a baby in 11 years and is aware of everything that means. The panic faded within 20 minutes. The attentiveness never did. "She has your eyes," Hazel said. "She has eyes," Silas said. "They don't look like anything yet." "They will," Hazel said. "They'll look like yours." He looked at the baby, then at Hazel. "You don't know that." "I know more about reading faces than you give me credit for," she said. She was right. Clara had his eyes. That same direct reading quality, the eyes that were always looking for the actual thing underneath the surface thing. It was disconcerting in a baby and became more so in a small child who applied it with the impartial thoroughness of someone who has not yet learned that staring at people is socially complex. Their second child came 2 years after the first, a boy, Joseph, who arrived with considerably more noise and urgency than Clara had, and maintained that orientation throughout his early life, which kept both parents engaged and occasionally exhausted and never bored. The children grew up knowing the mountain the way children know places they have always lived, not as something dramatic or exceptional, but as simply the shape of the world, the given thing. They knew the deer trail around the shale section and the shelf of rock above the cabin, and the sound the pines made in a northwest wind, and which mushrooms were safe and which weren't. And they knew these things the way they knew their own names. What they also knew, because they had been raised by people who believed in saying true things plainly, was the shape of how they'd come to be here. Hazel told Clara about the brown dress for the first time when Clara was 7, sitting at the table in the extended cabin while Joseph slept in the afternoon and Silas was in the barn. Clara listened with the reading attention she'd inherited and said, "She tore it on purpose?" "Yes." "Because you were—" Clara searched. "Because she didn't think you belonged?" "Because she decided I wasn't the kind of person whose belongings mattered," Hazel said. Which was wrong, but she believed it, and that made it feel true to her. Clara sat with this. She was a child who processed things visibly, in real time, without the learned concealment that adults acquire. "What did you do?" she said. "I kept going," Hazel said. "I was angry, and I was hurt, and I had no coat and one ruined dress and very little money, and I kept going. And then Papa came." "Your father came, yes, with very bad timing and no shirt in November." Clara considered this. Was it embarrassing that he had no shirt? For him, I don't think so, Hazel said. For the people watching, it was something else entirely. Clara almost smiled. That same almost smile that came from Silas, the one that didn't announce itself first. "Did you know then," Clara said, "that you'd end up here?" Hazel thought about this carefully, because she didn't like to give her daughter vague answers dressed up as wisdom. "No," she said. "I knew I trusted him. I knew he'd looked at me and seen what was actually there, not what he'd decided to see before he looked. That was—" She paused. "That was new at that point in my life. I didn't know yet what to do with it." "But you figured it out." "We both figured it out," Hazel said. "Together, slowly, by doing actual things and seeing what they were." Clara nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected about the way the world worked, which was the particular satisfaction of a child who has inherited a tendency to pay close attention. Silas and Hazel had a conversation once that Hazel returned to in her memory with some regularity. It happened in the 6th year, on a late summer evening, sitting outside the cabin on the bench Silas had built against the south wall, in the 2nd year because Hazel had mentioned once that she would like somewhere to sit in the evening when the day's work was done and the light was going. He'd built it the following week, without ceremony, from leftover lumber, and it was not a beautiful bench, but it was solid and it faced the right direction to catch the last of the western light. They were sitting on it with cups of coffee, which was their standard evening arrangement, and the valley was doing what the valley did in late summer, going gold in the low places, the shadows long, the air carrying the first suggestion of what the season intended to become. "Do you miss it?" Silas said. "Town." "Sometimes," she said. "I miss Mrs. Abernathy's kitchen. I miss Tom." "We see Tom." "Not enough." She drank her coffee. "Do you miss anything? From before?" He was quiet for the length of time it took a bird to cross the visible sky below the shelf. "I miss James," he said. "I'll always miss James. And Ruth." He said it with the steadiness of someone who has learned to carry a weight without putting it down, because some weights are not for putting down, only for distributing differently so you can keep moving under them. "But I don't miss the man I was when I came up this mountain. I was in bad shape." "You were surviving," she said. "Barely," he said. "And in a direction." "What direction?" He looked at her. "Away," he said simply. She understood what he meant. The direction of a man who has nothing to move toward, so he organizes himself around moving away from what he cannot bear. It was a direction she had traveled herself, in her own way, in her own years. Away from the places that had made her feel like an imposition. Away from the faces that looked through her. Away and away. Until she'd arrived in Iron Ridge with $3.40 and a notice board and a mule named Agnes who had no opinion of her, and a mountain that didn't care who she was. The mountain not caring who you were was, she had come to believe, one of the most useful things about it. "We're going in a different direction now," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." They sat with that in the way they sat with most true things, not picking at it, not embellishing it, just letting it be what it was. Below them, the valley was doing the thing it did every evening, indifferent to the people watching from above. The hawk was there. A hawk. Some hawk. They had decided long ago it didn't matter if it was the same one. Riding its invisible current. Oh, the thing about Iron Ridge was that it did what small places do. It remembered. It remembered Hazel Rowan arriving with a worn carpetbag and a single dress. It remembered what Margaret Hollis and her circle had done on Main Street and what Silas Boone had done in response. And the version that survived in the town's collective memory shifted over the years in the way of things that survive retelling. The dress getting more dramatically destroyed, Silas's entrance becoming more cinematic, the crowd's complicity becoming more shameful in retrospect than it had seemed in the moment. Harvey Spence told the story to anyone who would listen from his bench outside the feed store until he was too old to reliably remember the details, and then he told it with the wrong details, and nobody corrected him because the essential truth of it was intact even when the particulars weren't. Tom Riddle told it more accurately and with better timing, having been there for all of it, and Tom's version of things had the advantage of being told by someone who liked people and could convey that liking through language. Chester Doyle didn't tell it directly, but kept Hazel's name in the account ledger long after the delivery arrangement had evolved into something more substantial, and when people asked about the Mountain family, he said, "The Boones? Best arrangement this store ever made," which was both true and slightly sideways from what they were asking, but which was Chester's way. Margaret Hollis did not leave Iron Ridge. Hazel had not expected her to. She was not a woman who left places. She continued to run the dress shop and to organize the social currents of the town with considerable skill, and she never again did anything as direct as what she had done on Main Street. Whether this was from regret or from calculation, Hazel did not know and did not need to know. What she knew was that when they passed each other in town, which was monthly at minimum, Margaret Hollis nodded to Hazel with a correctness that was neither warm nor hostile, and Hazel nodded back, and that was the entirety of it. Dottie Crane moved away in the 3rd year, following her husband to a land claim further west. Vera Mast remained and aged and eventually became the kind of woman who has outlived her social context so completely that she is simply old rather than influential, which is what happens to everyone eventually if they live long enough. Eliza Pierce from the laundry became a genuine friend, which developed slowly and without particular incident over the years of Hazel's monthly trips to town. A cup of coffee shared, an opinion asked and given, the kind of accumulation of small, honest exchanges that becomes, at some point you can't precisely identify, an actual friendship rather than a pleasant acquaintance. Mrs. Abernathy died in the 7th year, which was a loss that Hazel felt with the specific sharp quality of a thing you hadn't known how much you were depending on until it was no longer there. She had been 73, which was a respectable age, and she died in her own bed in her own boarding house without drama or extended suffering, which was what she would have wanted and which was probably what she had organized, being the kind of woman who organized things. She left the boarding house to Tom Riddle, which surprised everyone except Hazel, who had watched the two of them together and had understood that Tom was the kind of young man that Mrs. Abernathy had privately adopted without either of them putting that name to it. Tom ran the boarding house well, in his own manner, which was looser than Mrs. Abernathy's, and occasionally more chaotic, but equally hospitable. Clara came down to the funeral with Hazel at 9 years old and stood beside her mother at the grave with that reading attention of hers, taking in everything. And afterward she said, "She was important to you." "She was," Hazel said. "More than just kind." "Yes." "How?" Hazel thought about this because Clara's questions deserved thought. "When I arrived here," she said, "with nothing, in a place where nobody wanted me to exist, she made me coffee. Not because she was sorry for me, because she was a woman who understood what it cost to keep going, and she recognized it when she saw it." She looked at the grave. "That was what she gave me. Recognition. Early, before I'd done anything to earn it. Just," she paused. "Just because she looked and she saw." Clara was quiet, absorbing this, the way she absorbed things that were going to stay with her. "Is that what Papa did too?" she said. Hazel looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said. "That's what your father did too." Net. In the 10th year, they added to the homestead in a way Hazel had been thinking about for 3 years and had mentioned to Silas obliquely twice before saying it directly, which was the pattern of things she wanted that she needed time to decide she had the right to want. "A school," she said. Silas looked up from the tool he'd been working on. "On the homestead? Or in town, but run from here." She had thought about this carefully. "There are 11 children in a 20-mile radius who are getting no education. Their parents are doing what they can, but there's nobody organized, nobody consistent." She set down her coffee cup. "I can read. I can do figures. I understand natural history and construction and land survey, and I've been doing the books for this homestead for 7 years, which requires actual accounting skill." "You've been doing the books for Chester too," Silas said, "for the past 3. "And Webb's surveying office?" she said. "Yes." He put down the tool. He looked at her with that full attention. "You've been running a school in everything but name for years," he said. She hadn't thought of it in those terms, but she understood immediately that he was right. Clara and Joseph. The Prentice children from the valley, who came up twice a week with their mother for exchanges and stayed for meals and had, over the years, absorbed a considerable quantity of mathematics and natural history and practical reasoning from Hazel and Silas, delivered in the course of normal conversation. The 2 young men who'd worked the homestead the previous summer and who had arrived unable to manage their own accounts and left able to. "Yes," she said. "Then do it properly," he said. It was the same quality of plainness he'd brought to every true thing. "What do you need?" What she needed turned out to be mostly organization and a willingness to ask people directly, which were things she had by that point in abundance. The schoolroom came from converting the storage room adjacent to the addition, which had always been too cold for storage anyway, into a proper space with a wood stove and a table long enough for 6 children and a shelf of books that Silas ordered in 3 separate deliveries from a bookseller in the Eastern Territory. The books arrived in crates, wrapped in oilcloth against the mountain weather, and the evening. They came. Silas opened the crates at the table, and he and Hazel went through them one by one, setting aside the ones that were right and the ones that needed supplementing. And Clara sat at the end of the table with her reading attention on at full intensity, and Joseph kept picking books up and putting them down again with the restless curiosity of a boy who wanted to know everything simultaneously, and Silas said at one point, mildly, "Joseph, put down the astronomy volume. You can look at it when we're done." And Joseph put it down and then picked up something else, and Hazel looked at the table full of books and her husband and her children and the room that had been built wrong twice before it was right, and she thought, this is the thing. Not the school specifically, the fact of building it, the fact of looking at what was needed and moving toward it rather than away. The fact that 10 years ago she had arrived at the bottom of a mountain with nothing, and the mountain had not cared who she was, and she had climbed it anyway and found what was at the top. She had not been looking for Silas Boone. She had been looking for $8 and a chance that no one else was willing to take. What she had found was a man who looked at her and saw what was actually there. And that had turned out to be the same thing, arrived at from opposite directions. "What are you thinking?" Silas said. She looked at him across the table of books. "About the first time I came up that trail," she said. "About Agnes." He almost smiled. "Agnes. She never liked me." "She didn't like anyone," he said. "I told you that." "She liked you a little." "She tolerated me," he said. "There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "I told you that too." "You told me a lot of useful things," she said. "So did you," he said. Outside, the mountain did what it always did. The pines talked in the wind, the creek ran over its rocks somewhere below. The stars assembled themselves in the cold, clear dark without any particular interest in the people below them. The hawk was wherever hawks go at night. Franklin was in the barn, old now, moving slowly but sound, with the easy confidence of an animal that has known its place for a long time and trusts it. The lamp was on the table. The books were spread across it. Clara had taken the astronomy volume while Joseph's back was turned and was reading it with the careful focus of a child who understands that the universe is large and wants to know exactly how large. Silas reached across the table and straightened one of the book crates. Not because it needed straightening, just because his hands needed to be doing something, which was his way. Hazel looked at all of it. 10 years ago, she had been told, in various languages both spoken and silent, that she did not belong, that she was the wrong size, the wrong kind, the wrong thing in the wrong place, that she had arrived somewhere without permission and would always be slightly in the way of whatever the right people were trying to do. She had not argued with any of it. She had just kept building. The fence, the delivery, the dress. The conversation in the dress shop said once and let go. The roof pitch corrected on a penciled drawing. The school assembled from a cold storage room and a crate of books. This was how it happened. Not in the dramatic moments, though there had been those. Not in the gestures, though those had mattered. In the accumulation of small, honest things, done with consistency over time, in the company of people who saw you clearly and were not afraid of what they saw. She thought about what she would tell her students next week, when the first organized lesson began. She thought about what she actually wanted them to know, past the figures and the reading and the natural history. She would tell them what she knew, that the world will often decide who you are before it's looked at you, that the deciding is the world's laziness, not your limitation, that the question is not whether you are welcome in the places you need to go, but whether you're willing to go anyway and do the work anyway and keep going when it costs you, because it will cost you, and the cost is real, but so is what you build while paying it. That strength is not the absence of feeling the cold. It's pulling Agnes's lead rope and walking into the timber anyway. That a man can live alone on a mountain for 4 years in punishment for surviving, and a woman can travel every road in the territory and sleep in second-floor rooms with no one waiting, and neither of those things has to be permanent, as long as both people are willing to look at what is actually there rather than what they've decided to be afraid of. She would tell them these things as facts in the same plain voice she used for mathematics and natural history because they were the same kind of thing. True, earned, capable of being passed on. Joseph reached across Clara and took back the astronomy volume, and Clara let him have it with the particular elder sibling magnanimity of someone who has already memorized the relevant section. And Silas saw this happen and looked at Hazel, and they shared the expression of two people who have made something complicated together and are quietly astonished that it worked. The lamp burned. The mountain held them up as it always had. The wind outside moved through the pines in that long, rolling wave of sound, and it sounded as it sometimes did to Hazel like the mountain breathing, slow and steady and vast, breathing out the day and into the dark, indifferent as it had always been, and perfect in its indifference and home.